So why do the madrasas like Nizamiya in Baghdad collapse in terms of their importance? Well, it's partially because of the Mongol destruction of Baghdad. In fact, the Shia are our enemies. So Israel's enemy, Iran, then becomes Saudi, Israel, and America's enemy.
The way you are, like your rulers are a reflection of yourself, basically. So if you want to fix the system, just fix yourself, which is fine. But then I saw this one book, which was, the title was Kama yuwalla alaykum takunu. Like the way your rulers are, that's how you're going to end up being.
Europeans are exterminating populations in certain parts of the globe. They're exterminating the Native Americans. They're exterminating the Australian Aborigines. They have plans to exterminate the people of Algeria. They're exterminating the Palestinians. We Muslims are going to be gone.
Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen wassalatu wassalamu ala Sayyidina Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa ashabihi wa man ihtada bihadihi wa iqtada bisunnatihi ila yawmiddin. Welcome everybody to the Project Ihya podcast and to our second episode on the global transformation of Islamic education in the modern period. And we have back with us Dr. Aria Nakissa. Welcome, Dr. Aria Nakissa.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I'm very happy to be here.
And just to remind everybody, Dr. Aria Nakissa holds a joint PhD in anthropology and Middle Eastern studies, and he is a senior lecturer at the International Islamic University, Indonesia. Having said that, inshallah, today's episode, we're going to be covering the progression of Islamic education around the Middle East, inshallah. And with that, I'll hand it over to Dr. Aria, inshallah, to present.
Okay, well, thank you very much for your introduction. So just to reorient our viewers, let me go ahead and start the slideshow. Okay? So as the viewers are aware, we're doing a series on the global transformation of Islamic education in the modern period. There are going to be 6 total episodes. We've already done episodes 1, episode 2. So right now we are going to do episode 3. So episodes 1 and episode 2 were kind of providing information on the nature of traditional Islamic education and some broad generalization about its transformations in the modern period, by which I mean roughly the last 200 years. However, now we want to be a little bit more detailed and look at different regions of the Muslim world and their specific educational institutions. And today we're going to look at the most important region, which is the Arab Middle East. So right now we're in episode...
Sorry to break in. I just wanted to apologize. I think I said that this was the second episode. This is the third episode. So yes.
Yeah. So okay. So let's begin by talking about the Islamic education in the Middle East. I'm going to go ahead and present some observations. In order to keep things simple, I'm not going to cite a lot of footnotes. But if you are interested in looking at footnotes and sources, primary sources, secondary sources, a lot of the material that I'm going to present today is from an article that I published this year. So in 2024, it's in the Oxford Journal of Law and Religion called Islamic Universities in Egypt and Indonesia. So it's really a global perspective on Islamic universities in the modern period, and it has some background information that I'm going to draw on today. So
this year, you meant
if we want...
Last year, I just found...
Yeah, last year, 2024. So if we want to understand Islamic education in the modern period, some particular countries and governments are important. One of the most important governments that we're going to have to keep in mind is the government of the Ottoman Empire. So which basically lasted from 1299 to 1922. It occupied much of the Middle East and North Africa, and also the Anatolian Peninsula and Southeast Asia. So in these Ottoman lands, there are many key Arab Middle Eastern centers of Islamic education, like Cairo, like Damascus, and then also Mecca and Medina. And then in addition to that, you have Istanbul, which in the pre-modern period is a very important center of Islamic education. So we're going to refer to the Ottoman Empire at appropriate times. But one other thing that another set of governments that we're going to keep in mind if we're concerned with the modern period is basically British and French governments. So in the Arab Middle East, in the colonial era, which you might say is roughly between 1800 to 1950, British and French imperial governments control much of the Arab Middle East. So, for instance, Morocco and Algeria are controlled by France, Egypt is controlled by Britain, and so on. You can get kind of a sense of things with this map. The parts of the Muslim world that are controlled by the British are in pink, and then the French controlled parts are in blue. So the Middle East and North Africa are the most important region for Islamic education in the pre-modern period and up until today. And there are a couple of reasons for that. So within 100 years of the death of the Prophet ﷺ, Muslim armies had conquered a large majority of the Middle East and North Africa. So they had established a state that basically stretched from Morocco in the west to Iran and the east. And these lands are kind of the oldest core area of the Muslim world. Initially, this area was ruled by Arab political elites that had established empires, initially the Umayyad Empire and then the Abbasid Empire. However, beginning in the 9th century, Turkic peoples, their military elites began increasing in political power and gradually displaced Arabs as rulers of the Middle East and North Africa. In fact, these Turkic elites not only come to rule the Middle East and North Africa, they also come to rule Central Asia and South Asia, which we'll see in later episodes. And then the most important kind of Turkic state that emerges is the Ottoman Empire, which dominates the Middle East and North Africa into the modern period. The Ottoman Empire saw itself as a protector of Islam, and it derived a lot of prestige from controlling Islam's holiest sites, which are al-Masjid al-Haram in Mecca, and then al-Masjid al-Nabawi in Medina, and then al-Masjid al-Aqsa in Jerusalem. There were a variety of peoples who lived under the Ottomans. So there were the Arabs, there were the Berbers, there were the Turks, there were the Kurds. However, the empire was headed by a largely Turkic, or more specifically Turkish Muslim elite in Anatolia. And like the previous Umayyad and Abbasid empires, the Ottoman Empire endorsed a Sunni version of Islam. Now, in the Middle East, there was an area that resisted Ottoman hegemony. This was the Iranian Empire, or this was Iran. So Iran was also ruled by a variety of Turkic empires, which were Shia. So there was the Safavid Empire and then the Qajar Empire. To understand the educational system in the Middle East, which is ultimately funded and given patronage by these empires, let me go ahead and say just a couple words about traditional Islamic education, recalling some of the major points that we discussed in episodes 1 and 2. So in the pre-modern, i.e. pre-1800 period, Muslim religious scholars began their studies at a basic religious school known as a Kuttab, which taught Quranic memorization, Arabic language skills, and other elementary forms of religious knowledge. Then when students were in their early teens, usually they transition to a higher level religious school known as a madrasa. So to understand the current educational system in the Middle East, let me say a few words about traditional Islamic education, picking up, just highlighting some of the points that we talked about in previous episodes. So in the pre-modern period, aspiring religious scholars began their study in a basic religious school called the Kutab, where they focused on Quranic memorization, Arabic language skills, and other elementary forms of religious knowledge. Then, when they were a little older, usually in their early teens, they transitioned to a higher level religious school known as a madrasa. What is a madrasa? It is a building, often a mosque, where Islamic scholars or sheikhs regularly teach. They offer study circles or halaqas scheduled around the 5 daily prayers. A typical madrasa contains areas for prayer and teaching as well as student accommodations. Smaller madrasas had less than 50 students, while larger madrasas might have hundreds of students. These madrasas were funded by endowments or awqaf. So these awqaf would provide funding to maintain the madrasas and the facilities, and they would also provide stipends for teachers and students so they could focus on teaching and learning rather than, let's say, working. Madrasa learning focused overwhelmingly on religious subjects like Quran, Sharia, theology, and also the study of the Arabic language, which was, of course, needed to understand key religious texts. There were certain non religious subjects that were taught, like mathematics, logic, and astronomy, although these received limited attention and were studied primarily insofar as they aided in religious understanding. Interestingly, madrasa learning was open ended, such that a student might spend decades learning at a particular madrasa institution. The higher the
One
level
thing
of
that I was
religious.
wondering about,
Oh, go ahead.
um, the point that you had mentioned about learning mathematics and logic, but it was primarily to the amount that was needed for religious knowledge. Um, does that not say something maybe, kind of stagnant about learning in the Islamic world, where it's kind of, recursive or dogmatic, where it's just the religious that is discussed, and there is no, you can say, like, freedom when it comes to the allowance of thought to progress on its own for logic and mathematics, or even any of the sciences, for them to be thought about more independently. Wouldn't maybe, like, kind of Orientalist argument also kind of fit here, that learning was just very dogmatic in the Islamic world?
Well, it's a very interesting point. So ultimately, we have to talk about what is a madrasa and what is motivating people to establish madrasas. So, what is motivating people to establish madrasas is people often establish madrasas as like a pious act. So, for that reason, there might be a king, there might be a wealthy merchant that wants the merit of transmitting religious knowledge, and they will establish a madrasa for that purpose. And what they do is they actually have a document. So when they set aside property, they have a document. And in that document, what they will usually write is certain types of knowledge are supposed to be taught. And if they're not really interested in teaching, let's say, medicine or logic or astronomy, because they don't believe that this is religiously meritorious. So in the madrasa document itself, in the founding document for the waqf, for the foundation, it's very much focused on religious learning. This is something that is discussed in a famous book by George Makdisi called The Rise of Colleges. However, one can easily misunderstand the implications of this for broader Islamic religious learning. In fact, knowledge transmission was not only conducted in madrasas in pre-modern Muslim societies. There were other institutions, one of which was the hospital or the bimaristan. So, for instance, if you wanted medical knowledge, you could learn a little bit of it at a madrasa, but you would learn it partially at a hospital. So a hospital was a site of learning. And indeed, even today, if you learn medicine, if you want to become a doctor, much of your learning takes place in a hospital. In addition, governments did fund endowments for madrasas, but they would also put aside endowments for libraries. They would put aside endowments for hospitals. They would put aside endowments for astronomical observatories. And at an astronomical observatory, that would be a place where you would study astronomy. In a hospital, that would be a place where you would study medicine. in a palace where they would often have a library, because keep in mind we're talking about an era where books are extremely expensive because they're manuscripts, they have to be written by hand. It's only a very wealthy person that can have an extensive library, so people would study at palaces, like palace libraries. This would be another place where knowledge would be transmitted, especially for philosophers like, let's say, Ibn Sina. And a lot of the knowledge transmission the model was less institutional and more person to person. So this is known when it comes to Islamic knowledge. Like, yes, to some extent, Islamic knowledge is tied to institutions, but to some extent, any major religious scholar can simply teach you independently in his home, in a Sufi lodge, in some other context, and give you an ijaza. There was also a lot of informal person to person knowledge transmission when it came to the study of medicine and philosophy and these other fields. So it's not so much that Islamic societies don't have various forms of knowledge transmission, including those that are more oriented towards, let's say, uh, purely rational, like ulum, which are aqliya as opposed to naqliya. The issue is simply that the madrasa institution is focused on the more revealed, religiously focused forms of knowledge. Although it's interesting because even here things are more complex than they might appear. So eventually you will have situations where people will start establishing kulliyas. They will start establishing complexes where there are madrasas and hospitals and all these things located together. And this is a place where at least there's the opportunity of kind of more exchanges of knowledge between different fields. So that is what I'd have to. So I mean, people have moved away from maybe the Orientalist paradigm in this respect. They maybe earlier on they thought, okay, knowledge transmission in Islam is restricted to the madrasa, and the madrasa really privileges revealed forms of knowledge, of ulum and naqliya. But then later on, they've said, well, maybe we have not taken into account that there are other institutional and non institutional contexts where knowledge transmission occurs just outside of madrasas. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, definitely. That's very helpful. So the idea is that there's more nuance to, how knowledge was acquired back then, and it wasn't just through a madrasa, but also different settings. And so the discussion that we're having here is more focused on the madrasa itself.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. So, not all madrasas are the same, just like not all universities today are the same. Some have a higher level of status than others, and that's tied to a number of different factors, like their funding, and most importantly, who are the sheikhs, who are the people who are teaching there. So, oftentimes in the Muslim world, people wouldn't study at one madrasa. They would actually study at a number of different madrasas, and they would go on to the madrasas that were the most famous. So they would begin by studying at kind of like a local madrasa for the most basic forms of knowledge. And then as they wanted to pursue more advanced studies, they would go to the higher level madrasas. So the highest level madrasas in the Muslim world were disproportionately located in the Middle East, and you would have people coming from other regions of the Muslim world. So you would have people coming from Southeast Asia, you would have people coming from sub-Saharan Africa, and going to places like, so maybe they would start their initial studies in local madrasas in, let's say, Southeast Asia or Sub-Saharan Africa, but then later on, they would come to study in Mecca at Al Masjid al Haram, or they would come to study at Al Azhar University. This is a trend that began in the pre-modern period and continues actually to this day. Um, So, one of the interesting things which is characteristic of the governments of the Middle East, like the Abbasids and the Ottomans and the Qajars, is that these are very large empires that rule over a lot of agricultural lands that generate a lot of tax revenue, and they use that tax revenue to fund major mosques, libraries, and madrasas. And this isn't something that we can take for granted because there are many parts of the Muslim world, once again, especially those areas that are seen as more peripheral in the pre-modern period, like sub-Saharan Africa and Southeast Asia, where they don't have the same kind of large empires. Yes, I admit that there are, some larger empires to some extent, but overall, in terms of the scale and in terms of the tax revenue, they don't have this kind of money. So they don't have large agricultural lands that are yielding up a bunch of tax revenues, and hence they cannot use that money to fund big madrasas or pay high salaries to students, pay high salaries to teachers, or pay big stipends to students. And for that reason, areas that have less money historically are not as important as centers of learning. So the Arab Middle East is historically in the pre-modern period considered a wealthier area of the Muslim world, and this is very important. And actually, but this is one of the things that's actually shifting in the modern period. So, for instance, Southeast Asia is traditionally a peripheral region precisely because of economic factors, but now as the economy is increasing, you kind of have a shift and a rise in their educational institutions. For instance, also Sub-Saharan Africa is becoming more important over time if you start talking about late 20th century. So the Ottoman Empire establishes some major Sunni hubs of learning in Turkish Anatolia, in terms, especially in Istanbul, where you have Suleymaniye and Samaniya, and we're going to talk about those in episode 4. But today we're going to limit ourselves to the madrasas of the Arab world. So if you're talking about the pre-modern period, there are all kinds of important madrasas that you find in the Arab world. In Baghdad, you have Nizamiya and Mustansiriya. In Damascus, you have Zahiriya and Adiliya. In Cairo, you have Salahiyya and Sultan Hassan. In Granada, kind of Spain, you have Yusufiya. But one of the things that people don't recognize is that madrasas, or people can easily overlook, is that madrasas in Islamic history can rise and fall. So you can have a madrasa which is very famous at one moment in history, and then it loses its fame. And oftentimes that's because of historical reasons. So why do the madrasas like Nizamiya in Baghdad collapse in terms of their importance? Well, it's partially because of the Mongol destruction of Baghdad, which destroys kind of the area, a lot of the built environment, but also results in economic issues. So there's not as much funding for the madrasas. Or why does Yusufiya in Granada collapse? Well, that's because the Spanish government, the Spanish Christian government, kind of conquers the area. So when we go ahead and think about the period kind of on the eve of the modern period, so around 1800, what are the most important madrasas? At this time, the most important madrasas are Al-Azhar in Cairo, Al-Masjid al-Haram in Mecca, Al-Qarawiyyin in Fez, and Al-Zaytuna in Tunis. And I should say that people will say, like, is Al-Masjid al-Haram, is it a mosque or a madrasa? And is Azhar a mosque or a madrasa? Oftentimes these are double, like they have a double function. So yes, they are mosques, but they're also people who have put aside endowments to fund teachers and students and student accommodations. So the line between mosque and madrasa are often combined when we talk about traditional Islamic learning. And then in the Middle East, you also have some very important Shia centers of learning that we won't get into. But for instance, the Twelver Shia have their most important centers of learning in Najaf and Karbala in Iraq, and then in Qom in Iran. And once again, this is because you have a lot of it is you have the Iranian government, which is a big empire like Safavids and Qajars, funding learning institutions in this region. Now, this is also one of the reasons why religious authorities in the Arab world become so influential. So, when we think about who are the most important Islamic scholars in history, there's a similarity for when we think of, who are the most important scholars in the Western world. So, today, if someone said, who are the big scholars in the Western world? And we're talking about secular knowledge, you'd say, oh, it's someone associated with Oxford University or Harvard University. These are universities that have big budgets. They can do a lot of research. They can pay a lot of money to their professors. They can pay a lot of money to students. In the Muslim world, you have a somewhat a similar situation where you have these comparatively well-funded madrasas in the Arab world, and they're able to say, okay, Ghazali, you come teach at this madrasa, you come teach at this Nidamiya madrasa. And this is one of the reasons for the fame of particular scholars living in the Arab world. Okay, so since 1800, there have been major changes to all madrasas, all institutions of higher Islamic education across the world, in the Arab world and elsewhere. And these changes are basically introduced in two waves. So their first wave of changes occurs during the colonial era, roughly 1800 to 1950. These changes occur really under the governance of the European empires. And then there is a next wave of changes that happens in the post-colonial period. So around after World War II, around 1950, many of the Muslim lands like Algeria or Egypt or Iraq that are previously under European rule get some kind of independence. And basically in the first couple decades after independence, they make some additional changes. And the most important changes to traditional Islamic education basically are in place by the 1970s. And if we want to talk about what these changes reflect, what they reflect is a program of progressive religious reform. And that's a topic that we really discussed in some depth in episode 1 or episode 2. So both the colonial empires, the British, the French, the Russians, the Dutch, and then later the post-colonial states, the post-colonial independent states that succeed the empires, are really interested in progressive religious reform. And as you may recall, what is progressive religious reform? Progressive religious reform is basically when the government takes the lead in encouraging the creation of a new form of Islam, a reformed Islamic tradition that legitimates certain scientific findings and certain liberal human rights norms, like to some degree.
So when it comes to the Middle East, in your previous slide, you talk about how all of this changes around, the 1800. And so would you say, can you trace a direct genealogy of the involvement of colonial powers in the education system, or are you saying that this was more of a natural change that occurred just amongst the indigenous peoples? They decided, or they felt that they needed this kind of reform in their education, or was it more, something that was mechanistic, something that was, planned? And do we find an actual, traceable genealogy from the colonial powers of this?
Yeah, I mean, there is a bit of
Or was there
it's a
pushback
bit
though?
of both. So, as we'll see, the most important educational institution in the Arab Middle East, and indeed, arguably the entire Muslim world, is Al Azhar University. So, basically, between the late 19th century and early 20th century, the British forced reforms in Al Azhar University. A key figure here is Lord Cromer. So, under Lord Cromer in the late 1800s and early 1900s, they elevate Muhammad Abdu to a situation of control over Azhar University, and they ask him to take the lead in changing the structure of education and the curriculum. in order to push things in kind of a direction that embraces progressive religious reform. And this process is continued under Mustafa al-Maraghi, who, in addition to Rashid Rida, is one of Abdu's major students and is also sponsored by the British. In both cases, Abdu and Maraghi, so when we're talking about Abdu, we're talking about early 1900s. When we're talking about Maraghi, maybe we're talking around 1940s, 1930s, 1940s. I have to check the dates to be sure, but there's a significant amount of resistance from within Al Azhar to the changes that are being pushed by these figures, but the British sponsor them and kind of overcome the resistance. And if you read Lord Cromer's book, he has a book called Modern Egypt, where he says, I played an essential role in elevating Abdu. And he basically says that Abdu's role was similar to Syed Ahmed Khan. So people who study Islam in a South Asian context, and we'll talk about this in a later episode, are familiar with Syed Ahmed Khan. So Syed Ahmed Khan is someone who worked for the British government. He was a loyalist. Maybe around the 1870s, he played a lead role in establishing Mohammedan Anglo-Oriental College, or Aligarh. I think right now maybe it's called Aligarh University. And this was done with funding and direct support from the British government. And when it comes to the colonialism started earlier in India than other regions. So it started earlier in India than the Arab world. Really, the colonial transformation of Islamic education in India is something that starts happening in the late 1700s. So they're already going ahead and they're establishing institutions like Calcutta Madrasa, and they're going ahead and encouraging the emergence of religious reformers within Hinduism like Ram Mohan Roy, and also within Islam like Syed Ahmed Khan. And then they use what they have done in India as a model for the Arab world. So Lord Cromer was actually serving in India before he came to Egypt. And he said basically Muhammad Abdu is going to be the Egyptian version of Syed Ahmed Khan. You can talk about similar French measures that are taken at, let's say, Zaytuna University in Tunisia. But so someone might say all of this is just from the colonial powers. But this is a bit of an oversimplification. In reality, you have a situation where many Muslims say, look, the Europeans are exterminating populations in certain parts of the globe. They're exterminating the Native Americans. They're exterminating the Australian Aborigines. They have plans to exterminate the people of Algeria. They're exterminating the Palestinians. We Muslims are going to be gone. We are going to lose our lands. The only way that we can resist this is to accumulate some kind of power. And what does that power require? It requires scientific knowledge and a type of thinking that is a more scientific form of thinking, because that is how we can produce technologies and forms of economic production, like a level of economic productivity that will enable us to defend our lands. And many of them are very interested in what's happening in Japan with Meiji Restoration, kind of late 1800s Japan. They see a situation where Japan is under threat, but basically Japan adopts a bunch of Western models in terms of their educational system, and then they're able to build a strong economy and a lot of technological innovation, and they're able to defend their borders. And what they say is, what these elites in the Muslim world say is, unless we restructure our society to be more geared towards teaching science, researching science, and unless we restructure our economy to be more productive, we're not going to be able to defend our borders. And what does it mean to do that? It means that we need to be able to teach scientific topics like Darwinism. Without, for instance, someone saying, no, this conflicts with a religious teaching. Beyond that, we need to take, in our country, maybe a third of the land is Waqf land, and we need to take that land and use it for other things to basically fund an economy. So basically, we need to take all that money away from the religious universities. Beyond that, we need to educate the society so that it is not focused on the other world. Right now, we have a society where people derive their happiness from thinking that they're going to go to heaven and building families and, seeking forms of mystic experience. In reality, we need to create a society of people who are hard workers, who are interested in producing economic wealth to be enjoyed in this world. Because if we don't have a population of that type, we're not going to have economic growth, which is on par with that of the Europeans, and they're going to kill us. So you have people in places like, let's say, Turkey, and places like Iran. They will say, we need to restructure our society or we're dead. Like, that is, we're going to go the way of the Native Americans. And for that reason, yeah, if we weren't facing extermination at the hands of the Europeans, maybe we could maintain a society that is traditional in character and that is dominated by traditional Islamic ideals. And we could deal with a population that is resistant towards a modern scientific forms of thinking and a modern economy. Unfortunately, we don't have that option. And unless we teach the population, unless we get the population is going to resist these changes, the changes that need to be made, as long as they think that they violate the Islamic religion. So what we need to do is take over the Islamic educational system and teach the population that it is religiously legitimate to make these changes. So you have
So
this
you would
situation.
say it's not like you would say it's not as simplistic as just, colonial powers themselves informing this, but also maybe there's a native element that felt for the sake of their survival that this is the only, logical way forward. So it is a more complex situation.
Yeah, this is exactly what you have in Turkey. Like, the Turks keep trying to prevent you. So Europeans are doing things like ethnically cleansing and killing hundreds of thousands or millions of Muslims in southeastern Europe and in southern Russia. And they're all fleeing into Turkey as refugees. And the Turks, since the 1830s, 1840s, they start making different reforms. They start saying, okay, we're going to try and maintain some of our Islamic identity, but we're not going to make really radical changes, because if we made really radical changes, it would move us too far away from our traditional religious identity. But they make those changes, and that's not enough to stop the Europeans from taking land after land after land after land. Then by the time you have World War I, they're basically limited to the Anatolian Peninsula. That's all they have left. Southeastern Europe is gone. Mesopotamia is gone. Mecca and Medina is gone. Northern Africa is gone. And in fact, the Europeans want to carve up the Anatolian Peninsula. They want to say, okay, you're gone, Turks. And then Ataturk says, no, we need to make radical changes. I'm not a fan of Ataturk, okay? I'm not a fan of Ataturk. But the reason why that happened, the reason why people were willing to consider the type of radical changes that Ataturk proposed is a situation of terror and fear of being exterminated and completely losing all of their land. So I think one needs to be careful. We're not dealing with this situation where people in Muslim lands, or for that matter, China, or for that matter, Japan, or for that matter, Thailand, say, oh, the West is really fantastic. We love science. Science is so great. Western style modern Western civilization is so great, and we just really like it a lot, so we want to copy it. What they're dealing with is a situation where they're fearing extermination, and conquest and elimination, and they say, out of desperation, what do we need to do to survive? And they say, whether we're talking in, Japan, they will say Buddhism and Shintoism are great traditions, but ultimately, unless we make a radical break with them or how they've been understood up until now, we're not going to be able to survive. And you have the same type of thinking in China, and you have the same kind of thinking in the Muslim world. So it's not really unique. There's this kind of pressure in all of these places that is generated by a fear of imperial conquest and extermination at the hands of the
So
Europeans.
I mean, so perhaps you could address two
I mean, I
things
just
that
want to add one.
arise upon the point that you've mentioned. One is, do we find actual concrete evidence in writing where there are Muslim thinkers thinking about this, and they're clearly outlining the fact that it's a matter of survival, it's a matter of extermination. Do we find that, or is it kind of political projection that we or maybe academics are doing upon these people? That's one question. And the other question is, what would you say to somebody who would say that this is actually just their expression of Islam? Like, if we're talking about Muhammad Abdu, we're talking about Sir Syed Ahmed Khan, and you're saying they're people who are working with colonizers, who are working with Lord Cromer. But what if actually this is just their expression of Islam? Because we cannot say that Islam, there's a normative form of Islam, and we cannot say that certain people qualify as Islam. It's just different people have their different expressions of Islam. So what would you say to these two questions?
Okay, I mean, I think that they are very explicit. They are saying this very explicitly. So I'll give you an example. I'm looking up the quote right now. So this is from Jamaluddin al-Afghani. So Jamaluddin al-Afghani, a teacher of Muhammad Abdu, is obviously considered one of these classical figures. So he's writing this around maybe like 1880 or 1890. He says, Islamic states today are unfortunately pillaged and their property stolen, their territories occupied by foreigners, and their wealth in the possession of others. There is no day in which the foreigners do not grab a part of the Islamic lands, and there is no night in which foreigners do not make a group of Muslims obey their rule. They disgrace the Muslims, dissipate their pride. No longer is the command of the Muslims obeyed or their word heeded. The foreigners chain up the Muslims, put around their neck a yoke of servitude, debase them, humiliate their lineage, and they do not mention their name, but with insult. Sometimes they call them savages, and sometimes they regard them as hard-hearted and cruel, and finally consider them insane animals. What a disaster, what an affliction. Out of fear of the Europeans and Westerners, Muslims cannot sleep at night and have no peace in the daytime. The foreigners' influence has even affected their blood vessels to the extent that they shudder with fear when they hear the words of Russia and England. They become stupefied with dread when they hear the words of France and Germany. The foreigners are forever frightening these helpless people. Then, in addition to that, you have a famous. So that's in an article that I wrote called. If you wanted to see the citation, that's why it's in my easy comes to mind. It's called Islam and the Cognitive Study of Colonialism. There's also an article that I have in Arabica where Abdu is saying, no, they want to exterminate us. They say. Abdu specifically says. So someone might think, why does Muhammad Abdu collaborate with? Why does Muhammad Abdu collaborate with Lord Cromer? So one way that we could look at it is, he's just some kind of cartoon villain, and he's twirling his mustache, and he's thinking, how can I get a big payday from the British? I'm not denying that there is corruption and that there are financial incentives and everything else. But if you read his works, you can read my article in Arabica. He says, they are going to exterminate us. Do you understand? Do you get it? They're going to exterminate us. What other option do we have? At the beginning of his life, he said, no, we need to just kind of rebel against the Europeans. That's how we'll get them out of our lands. But then he started saying, okay, this is very this isn't going to work. We are not going to be in a position to rebel until we accumulate scientific and technological power like the Japanese, and that requires time. So the first step, even if we want to rebel at some later time, we need to introduce science and technological education and a Western form of the economy. And that's going to, and it's only at that point where we will even be able to dream of independence. And if we don't even take that step, we're going to be exterminated. So that is kind of that's kind of his perspective on things.
I just wanted to make an observation that probably a lot of viewers watching or listening to the explanation also would make, is that, for years now we've heard that Islam was spread by the sword and Islam was spread by the sword. But when we really look at it the way that was just explained, is that actually European thought in that, and the fear of being killed is how it actually spread throughout the world, and in the Muslim lands, and all these changes are happening. Mentioning here is a lot of it is driven by the fear of
Yeah,
the
that's
sword,
So,
really
fear
true
of
when it
Arya,
comes to
extermination, as you put
Muslims.
it.
But I also say it's exactly the same when you talk about the Japanese and the Chinese. Like they're saying the same things. Initially, they just said Europeans go away. We're not interested. Don't come to our lands. Like don't even dock at our shores. But then later on, the Europeans said, no, we're going to come take the lands anyway. And then they had to make a very painful break with Confucian and Buddhist and Shinto traditions for the sake of self preservation.
so what would you say to the second point that I had mentioned? Someone can say that, these are actually just other expressions of Islam, right? Like Muhammad Abdu, or Sir Syed Ahmed Khan. These are just their expressions of Islam, and that's a completely valid form of understanding Islam as well. It's not, reform or whatever you want to call it. It's just another expression of Islam.
I mean, what I would do is it depends on what you mean by expression of Islam. So, if you mean it depends, so there are kind of two different definitions that people will use when they talk about Islam. One definition of Islam is like Islam is understood by the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam and maybe by the Salaf. When some people say Islam, that's what they mean. That's a very influential definition in pre modern Islam. That's kind of like a base definition that people will use. Another is Islam is kind of just however any group of Muslims understands things, even if they come to an understanding which is quite different than anything that the Prophet ﷺ would have ever imagined. So if you start saying things like, when the Quran talks about jinn, it really means microbes. I'm not picking these things aren't like coming. I'm not saying these things as like hypotheticals. This is actually a famous example from Tafsir al-Manar and Muhammad Abdu. He says no, actually, when we like look in the Quran and it's talking about a jinn, oh well, jinn are invisible beings that in some hadith can cause sicknesses. So what are invisible beings that cause sicknesses? Is like viruses and microbes. Now, did Muhammad SAW and the Salaf as historical figures ever understand jinn in that way? I think you would have to say no. That's not something where you say, okay, well they didn't understand that, and that's based on my faith or my aqidah. You could be a non-Muslim and say, look, just as a historical fact, when people talked about jinn at the age of the Prophet ﷺ, they understood them to be spirit beings, not viruses or germs. The notion that jinn means germ is a reflection of modern scientific forms of thinking. It depends. If we want to, we can say that when it comes to Muhammad Abdu or Syed Ahmed Khan, that their understanding of Islam is radically different than Islam if we understand Islam to be the understanding of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam and the Salaf. But it is a type of Islam if we say that Islam, if we just by when we refer to Islam, we just mean as any understanding of, let's say, that of the Quran by someone who identifies as Muslim. So you could have someone today say, and people do say today, that maybe Islam also, according to me, Islam like allows zina. Why? Because now because the aim of the zina rule, the aim of the ban on zina, fornication, is to preserve paternity, and now we can preserve paternity through a DNA test. So that means zina is permitted in Islam. Yeah, I concede that someone today might have that understanding, but that understanding is quite different than the understanding of the historical figure of Muhammad Sallallahu and the Salaf. Does that make any sense?
Thank you so much.
Could we say that there's also a major shift in how, like in the understanding of success and progress, there's a major shift or a reform in the understanding of success and progress from the Islamic paradigm, where it's primarily based on a view of an afterlife, and the world not being holding a different secondary position, as opposed to a reformed sort of uh, position that's brought on by the colonial powers, where now success and progress
Yeah,
is shifted
absolutely. I mean,
towards
I think that a
material
traditional
success.
Islamic
But
worldview, and really a traditional Buddhist or Hindu or Christian worldview, it's not a scientific materialism. So they believe that there is this other dimension of existence, the ghaib. And they say ultimately this other dimension of existence, which is the existence where God is, which is the element of reality where God exists, where heaven exists, where hell exists. This is very important. This is, in fact, the most important aspect of reality. And when we talk about success, it's not just in the dunya, it's in this akhirah, this ghaib kind of akhirah dimension. Um, and their lives and consciousness and forms of social practice and institutions are really designed for success in the akhirah. Like, that's an important thing. And to the extent that in pre-modern Muslim societies, people will sacrifice elements of the dunya for the akhirah. Whereas once you start talking about a scientific materialist worldview that doesn't really give the same kind of emphasis or disregards the reality of the akhirah, then the way that pre-modern Muslim societies are structured comes to be seen as lacking in justification. And you kind of want to get rid of that. So,
yeah, I was saying it in relation to what Mufti Tufail was talking about, that can we call it reform or just another, we can say another presentation of Islam. Yeah, so I meant it from that angle, in the sense that it could be called reform because there is a very, you can say, essential reformation of how they think about success. Is it a material or is it spiritual?
yeah. So
So
they,
in that
they
sense, it
are
could be called
going
reform,
from the
a
early
reformed sort of Islam.
Muslims, or pre-modern Muslims generally really put the akhirah at the center of their religion. And in terms of knowledge, so much of their knowledge is certitude and
Yeah.
knowledge of God and knowledge of the unseen, and even certain experiences like fana, or certain types of ru'ya that they might have that could give them glimpses of that other realm. Whereas for modern reformers, their understanding of Islam is quite different from pre-modern Muslims. It's a type of understanding that doesn't disregard the akhirah or the ghaib completely, but it de-emphasizes it. There's a shift in focus. In that sense, there's a secularization of the Muslim mind. They're more of a focus on the dunya as opposed to the akhirah. And this is actually a theme that you find in Muhammad Abdu. He says people are too
Exactly.
concerned with the akhirah and too concerned with rituals that only relate to the akhirah. In fact, this is a type of bid'ah. The true Islam, the Islam that existed at the beginning, was not so akhirah focused. Okay, so what are some types? Those are really great
Interesting.
questions. Let me see if I can relate some of this to. So, how are we getting? So obviously, people are responding to these type of questions in new ways, and part of it has to do with changes that we're basically seeing in the colonial era between 1800 and 1950. And then in the post colonial era, especially the first couple decades after independence, like let's say 1950 to 1970 in countries across the Middle East. So, what kind of changes do we see? Number one, we have states, colonial states and later post colonial states, reduce the financial independence of religious institutions. So, basically, they take over their endowments, they take all of their endowments. A second thing that we see is governments establish special ministries of religious affairs that monitor and surveil the operation of madrasas and mosques and also their religious personnel in order to have a higher level of control over them. Another change that you see is that religious teachers, like people who are teaching in madrasa, people who are teaching in Islamic education, tend to become salaried state officials who whose salaries and appointments and promotions are controlled by the state. So basically, you have a situation where if you want to have a successful career as a religious teacher, you need to please the Ministry of Religious Affairs. And the Ministry of Religious Affairs is going to basically make sure that you get a promotion and you get a higher salary if the form of Islam you're preaching is one that legitimates state policies. And if it isn't, guess what? You're fired or you don't get the promotion. In reality, you could go to jail. I mean, that's the reality of the situation. Um, they enact measures to regulate the curriculum and teaching. So the state starts they have centralized regulation of all of the books that are taught and the subjects that are taught at the institutions of higher religious learning. The state government start mandating more non-religious subjects in the curriculum. So they start saying, oh, even if you're running an Islamic religious institution, you need to pay more attention to mathematics or biology or economics or whatnot. They also start saying that if you're running a university, even a religious university, part of your curriculum should include the study of Western liberal laws or norms. So you should have classes on human rights, Islam and human rights, international law. They also will require that their religious institutions, including their religious universities, endorse some kind of reformed version of Islam and often some kind of state nationalism, like loyalty to the Turkish state or Egyptian state or Malaysian state, and that they officially condemn forms of Islam that resist reform. So they will say, if you have a form of Islam that resists reform, it's considered radical or extremist or fanatic, and that's not to be funded by these state controlled institutions. Another thing that you have is in the colonial era and post-colonial era, you have a giant increase in the population. You have a giant increase in the population across the world, and one of the things that happens is these governments greatly expand and centralize the systems of religious education. So you have a much larger number of madrasas or religious universities, and they all come to be integrated into a giant state controlled network. So, this is a common phenomenon that you see across the Arab world. Okay. Now, one of the things that I mentioned earlier that I just would draw your attention to is when it comes to higher Islamic education in the modern period, you have kind of three basic models. The first is you have like a secular university, secular Western style university located in the Arab world, like let's say American University in Cairo or Cairo University, and they have a faculty or a department that is specialized in Islamic study. Another option is you have what's known as an Islamic university. So, an Islamic university is one that has some religious departments or faculties and some non religious departments or faculties. And they also have an Islamic moral environment. So, they have like a dress code, a ban on alcohol, a big mosque in the center of campus, and so on. And then you can also have kind of Islamic institutes, which are smaller than universities and that tend to be linked to a particular sheikh, that often combine pre-university and university level studies. These Islamic institutes are the closest to the pre-modern madrasas in terms of how they function. Okay, so what are the most important Middle Eastern states for Islamic education in the modern period? I would like to discuss six of them. So Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Morocco, Syria, Mauritania, and Yemen. I could list Sudan, but I'm going to talk about Sudan in our later episode, when we talk about education in sub-Saharan Africa. Because Sudan is one of these countries where you can classify it in terms of the Arab world or sub-Saharan Africa. In fact, this is reflected in their national policies. I think it's more useful for us to discuss it under the heading of sub-Saharan Africa, so we will do that in a later episode. But let's start with Egypt. Egypt is a particularly important country. Egypt is the most important Arab state. Historically into the modern period. Part of it is because it has by far the largest population of any Arab state, roughly 110 million people. So this is one reason why it's a very, very important country. Egypt has different types of different structures of higher religious education. So it does have a Islamic university with religious and non-religious faculties and an Islamic moral environment that we're going to talk about. And that is the Al-Azhar system, which is tied to the Al-Azhar Madrasa, the ancient Al-Azhar Madrasa. But I should say that this isn't the only site for religious learning that you would find in Egypt. In Egypt, another model of Islamic education is secular Western universities that have an Islam related faculty. So, the most important example of this is Cairo University. So, Cairo University is the most important state university, it's a non religious university in Egypt. And they have a particular faculty devoted to Arabic and Islamic studies called Dar al Ulum, and that was founded in 1871. So if you go to Cairo University, there's a faculty of engineering, there's a faculty of medicine, there's a faculty of literature, there's a faculty of commerce, there's a faculty of, let's say, pharmacy. But in addition to those faculties, they have a special faculty for Arabic and Islamic studies called Dar al Ulum that was founded in 1871. It offers BA, MA, and PhD degrees in different fields associated with Arabic and Islamic studies. And actually, Dar al Ulum is one of the most important sites for Islamic learning in the modern period. So many famous people are associated with Dar al Ulum, like Hassan al Banna, for instance, is associated with Dar al Ulum. Muhammad Abu Zahra is associated with the Dar al Ulum. Okay, in addition to this, but at Cairo University, you can study Islamic studies. The major place that you would study Islamic studies is the Dar al Ulum. But it's important to note that at Cairo University, you can do some research and learning at Islamic studies in other faculties. So some people will do research or they will teach classes on Islam in the arts faculty or in the law faculty. So if you're in the law faculty, you can teach about Sharia. If you're in the arts faculty, you can teach about the history of Islam. And a good example of this is Nasr Hamid Abu Zaid. He's kind of a very progressive modernist thinker. So he's at Cairo University in the arts faculty, or was at the arts faculty. And you have this at other Egyptian universities. So at other Egyptian universities, so they will be secular Western style universities like Alexandria University, that is founded in 1938, or Ain Shams University in Cairo, which is founded in 1950. These are Western style Islamic universities, but they have an arts faculty and they have a law faculty, and people in those faculties, if you're interested in Islamic studies and you're a student in Alexandria or Ain Shams University, you will study there. Now, someone might ask, well, why wouldn't everyone, if they want to study Islam, why wouldn't they just study at Al Azhar, which is the university that we'll talk about later on? But in order to study at Al Azhar University, you need a religious training beforehand. Like basically, you need, before you reach the university level, before you're 18, you need to have some kind of formal religious study at a set of institutions that we'll talk about. They're called the Azhar Institutes. But if you just go to imagine you're in Egypt and you go to a normal public school, but you're very interested in Islam, you're not eligible to do your BA, your MA, your PhD at Al Azhar. If you're interested in Islamic studies and you come up through the ordinary public school system or the ordinary private system in Egypt, you have to join a secular university. And then when you're at a secular university, you just go to one of their faculties like Darul Uloom, or you go to a arts faculty, or if you go to a law faculty, and that's where you can study religion. Does that make any sense? Okay. This is actually oh
So so those people who did want to go to Azhar University, were there institutions that were available to
yeah, I'm
them
basically
to
gonna I'm gonna
prepare them to
discuss
go to
this in a second. This is
Azhar?
actually a common situation in many Muslim countries.
Okay.
Many Muslim countries have a bifurcated educational system where they have primary, secondary, and tertiary institutions of education. So they have primary and secondary schools as well as universities. They have one branch which is all secular, and then they have another branch which is all religious. And the question is, to what extent and the state usually runs both of them. So they run a secular system of primary schools, secondary schools, and universities. They also run a religious system of primary schools, secondary schools, and universities. And the question is, under what situations can you cross over from one to the other? Because ordinarily, in a typical case, what happens is if you go to a religious primary and secondary school, then you go to a religious university. If you go to a secular primary and secondary school, then you have to go to a secular university. So, for instance, in the Egyptian system, as we'll talk about, their primary and secondary religious schools are called Al Ma'ahid Azhariya. So they're called Azhar Institutes. If you study at the Azhar Institutes, then when you do your BA, your MA, your PhD, you join one of the branches of Al Azhar University. But if you've just gone to a normal public school, then you join Cairo University, Alexandria University, Ain Shams. And if you want to study religion, you just go to one of their faculties like Darul Uloom or the arts faculty or the law faculty and study Sharia in one of the departments there. But hopefully, all of this will be clear in just a moment. So, in Egypt, if we want to understand the Azhar system of education, uh, we should talk a little bit about Egypt's history. So, Egypt has, in the pre modern period, they had many different madrasas, like Salahiyya Madrasa, Sultan Barqouk, Sultan Hassan. And one of the unique features about Cairo's madrasas since the 13th century is that some of the more prominent madrasas, starting with Salahiyya, teach all four madhabs. So that makes Cairo a very cosmopolitan center of learning. In fact, two really cosmopolitan centers of learning in the pre modern period. So one is Cairo, where you can learn the four madhabs, but another is Mecca, where you can learn the four madhabs. So in Mecca, people are coming to Mecca because of the Hajj and pilgrimage, but people will come to Cairo because they have these institutions, these madrasas, where they will teach all of the different madhabs and all of the different theological schools. So over time, you have Al Azhar become the most important madrasa. So probably by the 18th century, we can say that Al Azhar was the most important establishment of Islamic learning in the world. So many people outside of Egypt would come to Al Azhar to pursue their most advanced studies. Yeah, some of them were coming from sub-Saharan Africa. Some of them were coming from Southeast Asia. Some of them were coming from Central Asia, but even within the Arab world, they would come to Al Azhar. So you have a history of people coming from, let's say, Damascus. They will come from, let's say, Damascus or Syria, and they will study at Al Azhar, or they will come from Morocco and they will study at Al Azhar. Um, and as I said, one of the reasons why it's magnet is it has a big population, it has a large tax base, they have a lot of money to fund madrasa institutions, and it's also like a cosmopolitan area because they're teaching all of the madhabs. And as you probably are aware, there's a link between the madhabs and the theological schools. So the Shafi school is linked to Asharism, and the Hanafi school is linked to Maturidism, and the Hanbali school is linked to kind of like a Athari Aqidah. So you have kind of all of these different forms of knowledge and learning that are present in Cairo, in a place that is not true of other parts of the world. So Al Azhar is very large for a madrasa. At the beginning of the 19th century, it had 40 to 60 teachers who served about 1,500 to 3,000 students. So that's very, very large. As I said before, you can have a situation where a madrasa is less than 50 people. We should not think of pre-modern madrasas as being comparable in size to modern universities. Modern universities only emerge in the modern period over the past 200 years, where you have a huge jump in the size of populations inside and outside of the Muslim world, and also a shift from agricultural societies to kind of like an economy that is non-agricultural, where people need more advanced types of learning. So at present, if we want to talk about education in Egypt, it can be described as follows. And what goes for Egypt goes for many, many Muslim countries inside of the Arab world and outside of the Arab world. This education system is dominated by the state. Are there some private universities? Are there some private primary schools? Are there some private secondary schools? Yeah, there are, but it's not too big of a sector. One of the reasons why it's not too big of a sector is that could pose dangers for the state. Because the state wants to control the way that people are thinking. And in the Arab world, there is a relatively high amount of control. High amount of control exercised over the population, especially because there is worry of kind of certain types of movements, especially conservative Islamic movements. So people are there's kind of a lot of emphasis on state control of media and education. So basically, when we're talking about the Arab world generally, including Egypt, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Morocco, we're really talking about an educational system that is very much state dominated. And the state dominated education system has two components. So there is a nationwide network of non religious educational institutions, including primary schools, secondary schools, and universities. And these non religious educational institutions focus almost exclusively on non religious subjects. So they will teach things like mathematics and biology and foreign languages. They will also teach some small amount of religious subjects as well, because in the Arab world, usually religious learning is obligatory, like some small amount of religious learning is obligatory. One of the reasons for that is because the state usually endorses a particular reformed version of Islam. And if the state university, or if the state schools don't teach anything, they're worried that the population might lack guidance in that manner. So even the secular educational system in the Arab world does devote some attention to obligatory or religious instruction, but it's very limited. Then you also have a component of the educational system, the state educational system, which is religious in character. So it's a religious version of primary schools, secondary schools, and universities. In an Egyptian context, this is the Azhar system. So the primary and secondary schools are called Al-Ma'ahid Al-Azhariya, and then you have Azhar University. Basically, all of the universities are branches of Al Azhar University. So Al Azhar University isn't like one university in one city. It's like a network of universities with campuses in all of these different places. In terms of the figures, we can say that the Egyptian population right now is about 110 million people. About 20 million students are present in the state run, non religious primary and secondary schools. And you also have 2 million students in state run, non religious universities. Now, if we talk about the Azhar religious system, you have about 2 million students enrolled in the primary and secondary schools, the Al-Ma'ahid Al-Azhariya. And then studying at Al-Azhar University, you have about 400,000 students. And the Azhar system actually has 25 branch campuses. So the most important campus, or really two campuses, are located in Cairo, but you also have branch campuses in Alexandria, Tanta, Damanhur, Mansoura, Asyut. So all of them will say, oh, I'm a graduate from Al-Azhar University. I'm a graduate from Jamiat Al-Azhar. That doesn't mean that they graduated from the Cairo branch, although that's the most prestigious branch. It could mean that they graduated from the Alexandria branch or the Tanta branch. And in fact, this is very common in these different Arab countries that we're going to look at. The religious universities are integrated with one another. They're part of an integrated system. So they all teach a very similar curriculum. They all teach they're all structured in a similar way. For the most part, of course, there's some measure of variation, but there is an emphasis on kind of like centralized state control. And oftentimes, when we talk about religious universities in the Arab world, they're just kind of different branches of one system, and that system is controlled by a ministry of religious affairs. So if we're talking about Egypt, if we're talking about Morocco, if we're talking about Saudi Arabia, they have some state institution. Sometimes it'll be called Ministry of Religious Affairs, Ministry of Islamic Affairs, Supreme Council of Islamic Affairs. Sometimes it will be called the Ministry of Endowments. Oftentimes they are kind of mixed together with one another. But the bottom line is there's going to be some state institution that is in charge of controlling all of the religious universities and ensuring that they are teaching a progressive, reformed version of Islam, which is consistent with the state's policies and which also inculcates a type of nationalism. This is something that we're going to find in all of these different places. Now, unlike pre-modern madrasas, state-run Islamic universities in Egypt, and in fact outside of Egypt, are organized in terms of faculties or kulliyat. Now, what is a faculty? What is a kulliyah? A faculty is a faculty is a unit. It's a university unit that is devoted to a particular or a religious or non-religious subject. It typically has a single building, so each faculty will usually have its own building, and in that building there will be classes and classrooms and offices for faculty and administration. So there will be, for instance, a kulliyah that is devoted to the study of the Sharia, or there's a kulliyah devoted to the study of the Arabic language. Or there can be a non-religious kulliyah. There can be a kulliyah that's devoted to the study of economics or literature or medicine. So you have these kulliyahs. Each kulliyah issues bachelor's, master's, and doctoral degrees in its given subjects. Now, the more prestigious in Islam, one of the things that marks an Islamic university and that differentiates it from a secular university is it has lots of religious kulliyas. It has lots of religious faculties. And this is what we see happening in Egypt. So between the 1930s and the 1960s, the Egyptian state on Al Azhar develops a basic set of faculties for Islamic universities. So for Al Azhar, some of them are devoted to religious subjects and some of them are devoted to non religious subjects. And later on, this model is exported to the rest of the Arab world and even outside of the Arab world. So we can see it in places like Indonesia or Malaysia, for instance. So if we were to go today to Al Azhar, we would say we could go to any branch of Al Azhar University, like Cairo. We could go to Cairo, where the most important branches of Al Azhar are located, and we could say at Al Azhar they have a number of religious faculties. So there's a faculty of Sharia and law, a Sharia wal Qanun. There is a faculty of scripture and theology, which is called Usuluddin. There's a faculty of the Arabic language. There's a faculty of Islamic missionary activity. There's a faculty of the Quran. Those are the different religious faculties. If you want to specialize in the Sharia, obviously you study at the faculty of Sharia. If you want to specialize in Dawah activity, you go and study in the faculty of Islamic missionary activity. Now, what is a little bit strange to some people is at Al Azhar and other Islamic universities, you have all of these non religious faculties. So there will be a faculty at Al Azhar of commerce, of agriculture, of foreign languages, of medicine, of pharmacy, of dentistry, of engineering, of natural science, of media. Now, someone might say, why are there all these non-religious faculties found? This is obviously a big break with the pre-modern madrasa system, but what is essentially happening is the following. You have people in Egypt that are going through the religious primary and secondary schools like Al-Ma'ahid Al-Azhariya, but not all of them want to become religious scholars. Some of them say, yeah, I had a good tarbiyah, I had a good upbringing in these Ma'ahid Azhariya, but ultimately I want to become a doctor, or I want to become a dentist, or I want to become an engineer. So what Al Azhar University says is, yeah, okay, you can do that. Just study when you get to the university level, study engineering or study medicine or study pharmacy. And also, and the idea is that the people that you're going to get who graduate, like what does it mean to to have a BA from Al Azhar dentistry? Well, and at the very least means that you're going to be like a pious dentist. But in certain cases, you're also going to get crossover in terms of what is taught. So maybe, for instance, if you graduate from the Faculty of Economics, you're going to do some kind of Islamic economics. If you graduate from the Faculty of Media, you're going to maybe have a focus on media products like radio and television shows that have an Islamic theme, and so on. There's also going to be some level of crossover there, but this is actually a very common pattern. So one reason why people go to an Islamic university is their goal is not to become a religious scholar. Their goal, whether it's in Indonesia or Egypt or Malaysia, they don't go to an Islamic university to become a religious scholar. If you want to become a religious scholar, great. Get your BA, get your MA, get your PhD in Sharia. Go to the Sharia faculty, go to the Quran faculty, go to the Dawah faculty if you want to become a religious scholar. But maybe you're just someone who says, you know what, I don't want to become a religious scholar, but I want to be in an Islamic environment. So that's one reason why I'm at Al Azhar, this Islamic university. And on top of that, I want a wide range of Islamic courses. So, for instance, maybe I am studying dentistry, but I want to take some classes on Quran. I want to, study the Arabic language to some extent. So for that's another thing that will differ between attending an Islamic university like Al Azhar versus some secular university, and this is true in Islamic universities that we find in other parts of the Arab world. Okay, so that's what I had to say about Egypt. Let's move on to Saudi Arabia, which is probably the second most important site of religious education in the modern Arab world. So, Saudi Arabia is an interesting country. You can see that we have Mecca, and you can see that we have Medina and this in the Hijaz over here. But also in Central Arabia, in the Najd region, we have a city called Riyadh. And even though it's not clearly differentiated anymore, Riyadh is right next to another city called Dir'iyah. And this is very important for understanding the history of religious education in Saudi Arabia, as we'll see in just a moment. So prior to 1800, the major center of learning in Saudi Arabia is Mecca's Al Masjid al Haram, which is located in the Hijaz and which is part of the Ottoman Empire. It's not part of the Saudi Arabian state, it's part of the Ottoman Empire. But this changes when there is the emergence of a movement called Wahhabism, which is established by an individual named Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab. He lived 1703 to 1792. Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab has some ideas that are actually very common across the Muslim world between 1750 and 1850. And that includes a critique of certain forms of grave veneration, like istighatha, that are common in Muslim areas of the world, a criticism of certain Sufi ideas like Wahdat al-Wujud, like Ibn Arabi type Sufism, and this idea of moving back to a form of Islamic practice that is more closely based on Quran and Sunnah, even at the expense of removing some doctrines that are associated that have been followed on the basis of taqlid, or some accumulated practices that are seen as forms of bid'ah and which might legitimate magic or communication with jinn or soothsaying, or these kind of things. So across the entire Muslim world, you're going to find people like this. In an Indian context, maybe you find Shah Wali Allah. In a West African context, you're going to find Uthman Dan Fodio. In an Arabian context, you're going to find Shawkani and Sanani. But Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab is kind of one of the people with these ideas. Kind of to the extent that Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab is unique, it's more that he doesn't only believe in combating forms of religiosity that are tied to veneration of the dead, but he also believes in widespread use of takfir. Even though this is not the same as Wahhabis today. Most Wahhabis today don't actually believe in these things. But the historical Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab is someone who made widespread takfir. So he thought most people who were living in the Arabian Peninsula and under the Ottoman lands had fallen into shirk, and in fact could be treated as mushrik pagans. So was kind of like a really controversial view that he had. And then later, after the time of Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab, the other Wahhabis ended up changing this and moving away from it. But this was kind of like a unique element of his form of religion. And he formed an alliance with the Saud family. So in the middle of the 18th century. And what they did is the Saud family said, okay, you can be we will endorse and protect your Wahhabi version of religiosity, and we will rule. And what they said is basically, Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab said, you have a justification for waging jihad and taking control over all of the lands around you, because all of these lands are mushrik lands, and Islam requires a jihad against the mushriks, because they said the other Muslims are mushriks because they're practicing istighatha and grave veneration. And also you can take over the Hijaz and all these other kind of lands. And then through jihad, the Saudi state began becoming larger and larger. One of the reasons why they were able to expand at the expense of the Ottomans is the Ottomans at this time in the 18th and the 19th century are under pressure from the European empires. So the European empires are expanding. The Ottomans are fighting the Russians, they're fighting the French, they're fighting the British, and when they have all their resources focused on these European empires, they have less of an ability to defend themselves against Ibn Abdul Wahhab. Um, so Ibn Abdul
So
Wahhab is
just about
actually.
your
Oh,
point about the authenticity, sorry, just about your point about the authenticity movements. I wanted to pick your brain a little bit. Like when we talk about, Osman Danfodio or Shah Waliullah Dehlawi, when you say they're authenticity movements, I mean, what we see, for example, in Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab is, there's the specific idea of, certain groups that are involved in istighatha, that he sees as forms of shirk, and kind of opposing taqlid. However, Shah Waliullah Dahlawi, we don't see that. What we see is more of a method of verification. So we see tahqiq, right? Like he's not actually advocating against taqlid. He would have actually rather, vast majority of Muslims do taqlid. However, obviously he pushes towards verification, towards tahqiq, and kind of, going back to the texts and, seeing what are authentic practices from the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. We also see, for example, the whole idea of wahdatul wujud. He provides a kind of he has a methodology of tatbiq there, right, where he kind of synthesizes that to be something that is more in line with, what authentic beliefs should be according to the Quran and Sunnah. So we don't see that he's like, kind of going on this like takfiri mission, nor that he's advocating against taqlid or anything like that. So in what sense would you say Shah Waliullah Dahlawi, and I'm less aware of Uthman Danfodio, but in what sense would you, draw an analogy between the two of them and the authenticity movement pushed by Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab?
okay, so it's a really good point. So when we talk about people questioning taqlid or being concerned with bid'ah, so when I refer to an authenticity movement, what it means is people saying, no, we're not just going to accept the religious practices and beliefs uncritically as they exist right now. We're going to check them against the nusus, against the Quran and Sunnah. Now, you can check them against the Quran and Sunnah, and you could do it in two ways. You could say basically everything that can't be directly based on the Quran and Sunnah, I should throw it away. I don't acknowledge taqlid at all. So you could become like Ahlul Hadith or a modern type of Salafi or a Quranist and do something like that. That's not what's going on with Shah Waliullah or Uthman Danfodio or even Ibn Abdul Wahhab. None of them reject taqlid completely. But what they're saying is that in certain cases, uh, you can go ahead and say, generally speaking, I am going to follow taqlid. However, there could be certain cases where, let's say, there's an opinion in the Hanafi school or there's a Sufi practice that conflicts with scripture. And I'm not going to throw out, we should be bound by taqlid. But in certain cases, but when we're bound by taqlid, it's not like blind following of taqlid. There can be a certain amount of revision and flexibility within taqlid. So we're not just going to reduce the religion to following Quran and Hadith. We are going to follow, let's say, the Hanafi madhab, and we're going to acknowledge the validity of Sufism, or at least certain sober forms of Sufism like Naqshbandi Sufism. However, where you have certain practices, like let's say the using of musical instruments in Sufism, certain Sufi ideas like Wahdat al Wujud, certain types of maybe legal opinions. Maybe you would say, okay, Hanafis have this legal opinion where you can marry without the wali. Maybe in this situation, I might say, if I look at all of the evidence, the Shafi position is stronger. That's a situation where you're not saying, oh, I'm just going to derive the religion myself without any deference to tradition, but it is going ahead and being willing to revise some of the tradition to make it closer to the Quran and Hadith. And this is a theme that I think you can find throughout Islamic history. So, throughout Islamic history, you have various figures saying that we have an accumulation of certain ideas or practices that don't really fit the Quran and Hadith. So, one example is Imam al-Shafi'i. Imam al-Shafi'i says people are not always following the Quran and Hadith. Sometimes they're giving too much emphasis to, let's say, the local consensus, like the consensus of the people of Iraq or the consensus of the people of Hijaz or Medina, or they're giving too much emphasis to the sayings of the companions, and we need to move closer to Quran and Hadith. You can have a situation where you have Ibn Taymiyyah or Ahmed Surhindi saying that certain Sufi practices are too far away from the Quran and Hadith. It doesn't mean that they reject Sufism altogether, but it means that they're willing to say that certain Sufi practices don't have enough of a basis in the Quran and Hadith. When I talk about these movements in the 1750s and between 1750 and 1850, none of them are rejecting taqlid altogether. None of them are rejecting Sufism together. What they're saying is we need a form of taqlid and a form of Sufism that is more closely based on the nusus than what we had beforehand. And this is a theme that you get in Islamic history over and over again. What makes Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab unique is that he mixes it with a type of takfir. So people who don't, so Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab is not someone who rejects taqlid of the Hanbali school. No, he's a Hanbali. And in reality, he doesn't reject Sufism. He rejects certain Sufi practices. Sure, istighatha, sure, certain forms of tabarruk. Yeah, of course. Ibn Arabi, he doesn't like Ibn Arabi. Yeah, I grant that with respect to Ibn Abdul Wahhab. But Ibn Abdul Wahhab is not like Nasruddin al-Albani, for instance. He's not like the Ahlul Hadith in India. He is a muqallid. What is unique about Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab is not trying to move closer to Quran and Hadith. It's not criticizing grave veneration. Shawkani, San'ani, Dihlawi, Uthman Danfodio, all of these people have the same idea. All of them are saying when it comes to taqlid, we can't be blind muqallids. We also need to be sensitive that certain bid'ahs have crept into our religion. Everyone between the 1750s and the 1850s across the entire Muslim world is saying this, or many of them are saying this. This is a global movement. The issue is Ibn Abdul Wahhab says that people who differ with him are mushrik pagans who should be killed. Like that's the difference. So it's like that hard edge that makes him kind of a more controversial person. So, for instance, Shah Wali Allah Dehlawi will say things. He's very critical of grave veneration, but he doesn't say the people who venerate graves are like the pagan Quraysh and they're mushriks and they're non-Muslim. They're not Muslim anymore. He doesn't say most of the Muslim world are really mushriks. This is not something that Shah Wali Allah would say. So I think that this is maybe a difference, a significant difference between Ibn Abdul Wahhab and other figures of this type, other figures of this generation. So Ibn Abdul Wahhab is ultimately from Central Arabia or Najd. He's not from the Hijaz. In Najd, in the central area of Hijaz, the major center of learning was known as Ushayqir between the 16th and the early 18th centuries. But when you have the rise of the movement of Ibn Abdul Wahhab, when you have the rise of Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab in the mid 18th century and his partnership with the Saud clan, their headquarters becomes Diriyah and subsequently Riyadh. So Diriyah and Riyadh are located right next to each other. Like right now, they're the same city, but it's a Central Arabian city. And this basically becomes the hub of Wahhabi religious learning and Saudi power. Um, uh, One of the things that so you have kind of Wahhabism emerge, and this Wahhabi ideology, it crystallizes in the 18th century. It's found throughout the 19th century, but it starts undergoing change over the course of the 20th century, or you could even say late 19th, early 20th century. It starts undergoing a change, and it becomes less about being a form of like takfiri Hanbalism, and it comes to be more like the Salafism that we know today, like the Wahhabi Salafism. So one thing that you get with Saudi Arabian educational institutions in the course of the 20th century is they're no longer, over time, they no longer become muqallids of the, they're no longer muqallids, they no longer practice taqlid of the Hanbali school. They also turn categorically against Sufism, and also the takfir element, they get rid of it. Like it becomes kind of too radical. They stop takfiring other Muslims in the way that Ibn Abdul Wahhab did. And part of this is because over the course of the 20th century, Saudi Arabian religious life starts mixing with Egyptian religious life, especially through the figure of Rashid Rida. So Rashid Rida is kind of like a major figure. His ideas, Rashid Rida's ideas, come to influence the major Salafi figure Nasruddin al-Albani. And also, the developments in Saudi Arabia are linked to developments in Egypt through an institution known as Ansar Sunnah al-Muhammadiyah. So they're kind of like a institution that is in Egypt. So due to these Egyptian influences and Rashid Rida's influences and Muhammad Nasruddin al-Albani's influences, you get what we would Wahhabism becomes, over the course of the 20th century, what we would today call the Salafi Dawah. So the Salafi Dawah is one that rejects taqlid of madhabs, it rejects Sufism, generally speaking, but is not takfiri anymore. It's not takfiri like Ibn Abdul Wahhab. Uh, but this Dawah becomes very, very important for a number of different reasons. So recall that traditionally, Mecca and Medina are not only Mecca and Medina, but Jerusalem. So Islam's three holiest sites are controlled by the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire collapses in 1922 after being defeated by the Allies. And all of the lands, all of the holy places of the Ottoman Empire come to be taken by other political entities. So basically, Israel takes over Al-Masjid al-Aqsa in Jerusalem. And then the Hijaz comes to be taken over by the Saudi government. This happens in the 1920s. And then in the 1930s, Saudi Arabia discovers a lot of oil. So this makes the Saudi government much more influential than it would be otherwise. If the Saudi government, if it was just central, if the Saudi government was still just Najd, if it was just like Riyadh or Diriyah, people would say, why do I care about what your religious movement is about? But when they control Mecca and Medina, they say, okay, this is like a significant, like the Saudi state is a religiously significant state. And then when they have the oil revenues, that also gives them the ability to fund and develop religious institutions. So they start developing, with this oil money and with the prestige that comes from taking over Mecca and Medina, they start establishing a educational infrastructure, an infrastructure of higher religious education to propagate Salafism throughout the Muslim world. So in 1949, so one of the things they do when the Saudis take over in the 1920s, they basically end the Ottoman system. So the Ottoman system of religious education is like a Sufi oriented, taqlid oriented, non takfiri, type of traditionalism. So all of that is ended when the Saudi government takes over in the 1920s. They basically start restructuring religious life in the Arabian Peninsula. So one of the things that they do is in 1949 they establish one of their most important religious institutions, which is called al Qura University. Then in 1953, they established a university in Riyadh, which is Muhammad ibn Saud Islamic University. And in 1961, they established Islamic University of Medina. So these are probably the three most important institutions in Saudi Arabia. And Islamic University of Medina becomes very important for training people from other countries to accept the Salafi form of religiosity. So they will provide, with all the oil money that they have, they will provide stipends for people to come to Saudi Arabia and study at Islamic University of Medina. Saudi Arabia also starts funding educational institutions and religious movements outside of Saudi Arabia. So they fund a very, very important religious movement in West Africa called Yani Zawa. It starts revolutionizing religious life in West Africa since the 1970s. It's associated with figures, the most important figures, Abu Bakr al-Gumi, which really kind of spreads Salafi religiosity through West Africa. And then maybe in Southeast Asia, they have an institution that is a branch of Muhammad ibn Saud. It's called the Lipia in Jakarta in Indonesia. So they have kind of they have these branches of their universities throughout the Muslim world, and this is one of the factors that leads to the Salafi Dawah becoming very, very influential. Although there are other factors as well. I mean, one of the things that people really appreciate about the Salafi form of religiosity is until recently, it's seen as a very conservative. So, for instance, if you want a conservative form of Islam that kind of stands up to liberalism, liberal pressures, is not so willing to reform as maybe some other types of Islam. Um, this type of Salafi Islam is seen as desirable and authentic in that way. Although in the past 5 years, you have, because this Salafi religiosity is so closely tied to the Saudi government, when the Saudi government shifts its government policies, this radically alters the religious sphere. This is one of the issues when we talk about Arab educational systems generally. We're not talking about a decentralized religious sphere. We're talking about a situation where all the religious universities fall under the head of like a central ministry, and that central ministry can, if the government wants, change everything around very quickly. So that means, for instance, if the Saudi government wants to propagate a conservative form of Islam, they can do that. And if they don't want to do that, they can switch things out very quickly. So it's very much so this system is meant to give the government a significant amount of control, which can also mean that when there are shifts in government policies, you have very big shifts in the religious sphere and religious education. Okay. Oh, go ahead.
This kind of brings a question up about the centralization of sort of this Islamic knowledge in this way. I guess the question where that would start from is that there was, the British Empire kind of they kind of supported sort of the Saud family taking over or establishing the state of Saudi Arabia along with the Wahhabi sort of religious outlook or why would they do that if the Wahhabi position was one of tradition, very being very hardcore traditional and against modernization and change? Why would there be a colonial sort of push,
It's an interesting
pushing it
question.
into power,
I
sort of?
actually would say that initially the British weren't helping them directly. Like initially, what the British and the French were doing were just hurting the Ottomans, and the fact that the Ottomans were being weakened opened up the door for the Saudis to exert more power. I think that when
Okay.
if you want to talk about an alliance between the Saudis and the West, it's not really in the the 1700s or the 1800s. I don't even think that the Arab rebellion. So during World War One, there's an Arab rebellion against the that is coordinated by the British and Lawrence of Arabia, but the Saudis aren't really participating in that, from my understanding. The person who's leading it is Sharif Hussein, who is like ruling. He's allied with the Ottomans, and essentially what
Right.
happens is um, the Saudis take advantage of the political shifts and the weakening of the Ottomans. So they're not participating directly, from my understanding, in the revolt against the British, but they take advantage of the British efforts to destroy the Ottoman Empire to like move into the power vacuum. But actually, if the British had gotten their way, I think that they would have had Sharif Hussein. Like they would have had Sharif, because they put Sharif Hussein in. They wanted to have him as the ruler of the Hijaz, and then they wanted to have his sons, one of them ruling Jordan, who actually still rules Jordan, and then one of them ruling Iraq, who was ultimately overthrown by the Ba'ath
Right.
Party. I think ultimately Saudi Arabia was actually kind of like the West started forming a relationship with, especially America, started forming a relationship with Saudi Arabia. If I remember correctly, maybe 1940s, 1950s. Uh, and it's a very different situation then. Saudi Arabia in the 40s and the 50s and the 60s was like a pan Islamist, anti communist entity. So the U.S. was fighting the U.S. in the 1940s and
Hmm.
50s and 60s is not thinking that our primary enemy is Islam, because they're not run by the Israel lobby in the same way that they're influenced today. The Israel lobby doesn't have the same influence of U.S. foreign policy. U.S. foreign policy
Yeah.
in 1940s, 50s, 60s, they're thinking our major enemies, our major rivals are Russia and China, which, as you can see, that actually makes a lot of geopolitical sense. They're not saying our
Yeah.
major enemies is like radical Islam and radical Muslims imposing Sharia in Oklahoma, yeah, or like
Yeah.
take.
I was talking more of like the British Empire. Yeah. No, I was talking more about like historical the British Empire and but you're saying that the whole movement is sort of a consequence
Yeah,
of
so
them
I
trying
think it
to
was like
dismantle
I
the
don't think that the British
Ottoman
Empire or like the
empire of the
US
time.
wanted the Saudis to take control. I just think they wanted to break up the British Empire and break up Muslim power in the Middle East.
Right.
Then the Saudis took control. Then there was like an alliance against communism during the Cold War in the 50s and the 60s. Although at that time the Saudis were doing lots of things that the West didn't like, because on the one hand they said, "Oh, we're gonna help you fight communism." The West is really worried that the Arabs are going to go over to the Soviets and that they're all going to become communist. So Saudi Arabia says, no, we're going to actually support the Muslim Brotherhood, and we're going to like have a bunch of Muslim Brotherhood type people like Said Qutb's brother and other people come to Saudi Arabia. And up until the time of King Faisal, they're pursuing all these pan-Islamic projects. But then ultimately, the US wins the Cold War, and the US comes to increasingly be influenced by Israel in the 1970s and 1980s and 1990s. And US foreign policy starts becoming less about fighting communism and fending off Russia and China. And it comes to say that our major enemy is radical, quote unquote, Islam. And then Saudi Arabia starts getting changed. Saudi Arabia actually turns against Islamist movements and the Muslim Brotherhood. So this basically happens, especially after the Iranian Revolution in the 70s and 80s. Basically, Saudi Arabia turns, and then it starts becoming very close to the U.S. And their policy starts becoming increasingly a policy of countering Islamic movements across the world, and also kind of building a Israel America Sunni Arab alliance against Iran and like a Shia axis. This is like after 80s and 90s, I'd say.
Mhm.
Yeah, that's how we get where we are
Well,
today.
it's current
Like,
also, I think.
believe it or not, at the time of Faisal, you have the Saudi
Yeah.
Arabian government, and they're saying things like, "Oh, Sunni," because they're also like an Ikhwani mindset. They're like, all Muslims should have like a should be getting together. Like, Ikhwan is good, and let's have Ikhwani Muslims
Yeah.
cooperate with Saudi Muslims, cooperate with Shia Muslims against the West. This is the type of mindset that is emerging in the colonial
Yeah. It
period,
sounds very
because
different.
basically in the colonial era you have people like Afghani, who is a Shia, joining on with Muhammad Abdu, joining on with Wahhabis, and all of them are saying like our enemy is the West. Our enemy are these liberal Western powers that are cooperating against our lands. So and our enemies are like liberalism and communism. So this is the type of Muslim thinking that you have in the 50s and the 60s. But after that, after the 50s and the 60s, you have a shift where, for instance, Saudi Arabia starts saying, no, in fact, Ikhwan are not our friends. Ikhwan are our enemies because they want to overthrow the monarchy. So in fact, we need to like aid in the we're really we need to aid in the creation of like a type of madkhali ideology to crack down on Ikhwan. And they also start saying, no, we don't want to have like a Sunni Shia cooperation against the West. In fact, the Shia are our enemies. So Israel's enemy, Iran, then becomes Saudi, Israel, and America's enemy. So it's just like a giant shift that you
Mm.
get between the 70s and the 90s that you still have today, but which is radically different than the type of Islamist politics or Islamic politics. I mean, if you think about it right now, why do one could very easily imagine a world where someone is like a Wahhabi Salafi and says, "Oh yeah, Ikhwan has some good ideas." Yeah, we don't agree with Ikhwan on a lot of things, but we're closer to Ikhwan than, let's say, secular governments. But now you have a situation where many of the Salafis would say, no, in fact, Ikhwan is, highly deviant, and in fact, in many cases, we want to support secular governments to crack down on Ikhwan. So it's kind of like the reason why this can happen is because the Saudi religious universities are controlled by the state. So whenever the Saudi state has an enemy, when the enemy of the Saudi state was the Ottoman Empire, all the Saudi religious scholars said we're against the Quburis, we're against they're guilty of shirk, we can take over the Hijaz, we can fight the Ottomans because they're mushriks. And then later on, they started saying they also started saying we're against the Shia, and then later on they started saying we're against Ikhwan and the Islamists. And whenever the Saudi government basically says these are our geopolitical enemies, the Saudi religious institutions and its scholars, they provide legitimation to them. This is a common pattern that you find in kind of whenever you have a system of
Interesting.
religious universities that is controlled by a state. This is the kind of thing that will result is you have government policies, government geopolitics being legitimated by your religious scholars. I'm not trying to single out Saudi for criticism in that way. This is something you find in every country. Whenever you have religious institutions controlled by any state, those religious institutions will start legitimating state policy. So does that make sense?
Yeah, and one interesting point here, like I remember, I'm sure you've heard the sort of Sufi argument, like kama takunu yuwalla alaykum, right? The way you are, uh, you know, that's the way. Like your rulers are a reflection of yourself, basically. So if you want to
Your
fix the
leaders.
system, just fix yourself, which is fine. But then I saw this one book, which was the title was "Kama yuwalla alaykum takunu," like the way your rulers are, that's how you're going to end up being.
I mean, but it is problematic, right? Because كما تكونوا يولى عليكم, this is actually a statement that is attributed to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, um, by Dailami. There is some criticism on the isnad, on the chain, but nonetheless, I mean, this meaning is established from like multiple ayat as well, right? Where in the Quran it says ظهر الفساد في البر والبحر بما كسبت أيدي الناس, and then also in the beginning of Surah Al-Isra as well. So I wouldn't say it's like a particularly Sufi argument. If the idea is that Islam is completely bottom up, right? That there's no necessity whatsoever for any kind of political involvement, then that would definitely be maybe a more Sufi approach, and maybe problematic to some degree. However, like the idea in general that political leaders are a reflection of the amal of the people on the ground. This is something that is found in the Sunnah as well.
Yeah, but even if you even if you accept the the thubut of that, right, which is itself debated, still there could be, it doesn't necessarily mean, like you yourself said, that it's completely bottom up, which, but a lot of times you'll have certain groups, and then you'll find in their followers, like for example, if you talk about politics, there'll be a lot of hand waving, right? Oh, this is not important at all, um, and just focus, but they're totally unaware of this whole plan that's been going on for so long, colonial, post-colonial efforts to shape us into what we are today. So like you correctly said, like it's a combination of both things, and yeah, that's what I was
Yeah, I
trying to
would I
point
would
out.
agree that it's a combination. So the bottom up aspect is essential. Also, the top down aspect is important as well. And even when people portray Sufis, I mean, in the past, a lot of these Sufis were very rebellious. If you talk about
Yeah,
Abdul Qadir al Jazairi, like all of these, when you talk about like, or Al Hajj Omar Tal in West Africa, like these are all like jihadist Sufi movements. The Sufis that we have today are,
not reflective of the Sufis
yeah,
of the
this is
past.
not like the pre-modern Sufis. The Sufis of the late 1700s, early 1800s were seen as like a huge security threat. Like they were all like, had these big tariqa networks, and they were leading all of these, giant anti-colonial rebellions. The notion of like the individualistic Sufi who is unconcerned with politics, I grant that Sufism, in terms of its focus on the batin or the qalb, this internal psychological or spiritual dimension, is there. Um, However, the modern tendency to reduce Sufism to that, I do think has been the product of certain reform of Sufi doctrine, so that it's more consistent with a secular ideology. And I think sometimes people will say, uh, to say that Islam is really just about, to say that so it's one thing to say that Sufis emphasized or even prioritized the inner over the outer. But to say that they thought that the outer is not an essential element, I don't think would be correct when we talk about the Orthodox Sufi groups. So the Orthodox Sufi groups are like very much pro Sharia groups. And I think that modern reform efforts have, or when it comes to religious reform, have resulted in a situation where often this type of Sharia compliant Sufism has been maybe molded or downplayed or marginalized. So I mean, in terms of, so Egypt and Saudi Arabia, these are the two most important countries when we talk about education in the modern Arab world. I want to touch a little bit more briefly on some other important countries. Or of the more important countries. So one of them is Morocco. Morocco has many of the features that we find in a place like Egypt. Historically, the most important madrasa in Egypt has been Al Qarawiyyin, which is located in the city of Fez. Um, and today we can say that Morocco has a number of state controlled institutions. Some of them are Islamic universities, some of them are Western universities with an Islamic studies faculty. So Al Qarawiyyin is like an Islamic university, and it has its campus in Fez. It's kind of was developed out of Al Qarawiyyin Madrasa in the same way that Al Azhar University was developed out of the ancient Al Azhar Madrasa and Mosque. And El Qarawiyyin was originally founded, in 1850, around 1857. So quite an CE. So this is quite an old institution. More recent but very important institution is Dar al Hadith al Hassaniya, which is located in Rabat. This was established in 1964. Then, in addition to that, so probably if you were going to talk about the two most important higher educational institutions in Morocco for religious education would be Qarawiyyin and Darul Hadith al Hassani. But you could also add in some of the faculties that are located, that are part of these secular universities. So Sidi Muhammad ibn Abdullah University in Fez has an important faculty of Islamic studies, sometimes referred to as Dar al-Mahrez. Also, Muhammad V University in Agadir and Hassan II University in Casablanca both have notable Islamic studies faculties. But generally speaking, all of the secular style Moroccan universities do have an Islamic studies faculty. So in terms of Syria, Syria is an important land for Islamic studies. It historically has many madrasas. You also have this symbiotic relationship between Syria and Egypt. Many of them people will start studying in Syria at a local madrasa and then go to Egypt for advanced studies. We see this with some of the more notable Syrian religious personalities like Muhammad Said Ramadan al-Bouti, and then kind of like the more state official figure of Ahmed Badruddin Hassoun. These are figures who started their studies in Syria, but then later on attained advanced degrees from Al-Azhar. One particular notable institution of Islamic higher education in Syria is a faculty at Damascus University. So Damascus University is this very important university in Syria, perhaps the most important public university, founded in 1923. Since it is a secular university, it has a wide variety of faculties, from architecture to economics to civil engineering and pharmacy, but it also has an important faculty of Sharia, Kulliyat al-Sharia, which was founded in 1954. This is where Muhammad Said Ramadan al-Bouti taught. So this is a good example of how you can have a country where it's important, or among its most important religious institutions are not Islamic universities, but rather an Islamic faculty or a Sharia faculty that's part of a secular university. Mauritania and Yemen are two other countries that I'd briefly like to touch on. So when we talk about traditionalist approaches to Islam, and by traditionalist I mean, okay, you're very much emphasizing taqlid, so you're following one of the four madhabs, you're a member of a Sufi tariqah, you're a member of a traditional theological school, like maybe you're an Ash'ari or a Maturidi. This type of traditional form of Islam starts getting displaced in many of the Arab countries between the late 19th century and the mid 20th century. So at Al Azhar, at Qarawiyyin, at Zaytuna, this type of traditionalist Islam gets displaced by a type of Islam that says, okay, we're not going to make taqlid of the madhabs. We're going to be very critical of Sufism. Basically like Muhammad Abdu type modernism, which maybe in a Tunisian context would be associated with which would be associated with Ibn Ashur. In a Algerian context, it would be associated with Ibn Badis. So you have this, or in a Moroccan context, it would be associated with Alal al-Fasi. You have these shifts towards a type of modernism, modernistic, ijtihad oriented approach, which is not really deferential, which kind of really takes a strong stance against taqlid. So Azhar and Qarawin and Zaytuna, which are in the pre-modern period centers of traditionalist knowledge, there's still centers of traditionalist knowledge, but the traditionalism is displaced by kind of a modernistic religious trends. And then you also have the traditional knowledge that is taught at Al Masjid al Haram. This comes to an end or very much declines with the rise of Wahhabism and then when it gradually transformed into Salafism. Okay, so if you want to really study pre-modern type traditionalism, where do you go? Yeah, you can still go to Al Azhar, you can still go to one of these other places, but two areas where people will often start going in the 20th century will be Yemen and Mauritania. And that's because these are areas which are very poor desert areas with low populations, with low levels of economic development. They're less transformed by modern trends than some of these big cities like, let's say, Cairo or Damascus or the cities of Morocco. So in Mauritania and Yemen, just generally speaking, these are less economically developed countries. They have more traditional lifestyles and they maintain madrasas that are more traditionally oriented. And in fact, these are parts of the world in Mauritania and Yemen. They didn't really have that much money compared to Cairo, compared to Damascus, compared to Istanbul. Uh, they weren't really building these huge madrasas and mosques. To a large extent, their education in these countries focused more on individual scholars that would just offer lessons in local mosques or even in their own homes. So Mauritania, which is often called Bilad al-Shinqi, many people who are educated in the Mauritanian context have call themselves a Shinqiti. So Islam enters into Mauritania around the 8th century CE, but it didn't automatically become a center of learning. It kind of became more famous for learning between the 16th and 18th centuries, and then it was only in the late 19th century that not only was it known as a center of learning, a notable center of learning, but it came to be recognized as having like a global reputation. And that's because Mauritanian education developed some unique features. So one is memorizing, just memorizing a lot of texts. And the other is very intensive mastery of the Arabic language through composition and study of poetry, like composing your own poetry. So when a Mauritanian scholar like Didou starts speaking, it's like a computer. I mean, it's a very impressive that someone can just like cite these texts and there's not like stuttering, there's not like pausing, it just like comes together immediately. Like when he's speaking, it's like he's writing a book, and people have been shocked by these. So there aren't that many Mauritanians. Mauritania is not a wealthy country, it doesn't have that many people, but it has this very demanding but strong educational system, where people will really force you to memorize a lot of texts and compose poetry. And on top of that, in Mauritania, there's not a lot to do. Like a lot of these places where people study are just small cities in kind of like a desert type area. So people will just really focus on the study of a knowledge. So you will have like famous scholars like Abdullah bin Bayya or Didou coming from this context, and many people over the 20th century coming out of this context and winning a reputation. Okay, just given time limits, I won't go into this in a lot of depth. But these in Mauritania, you still have just scholars in small villages with a good reputation. They will attract students. They don't necessarily have giant madrasas, um, but that people will build personal relations with these scholars and learn from them and learn this specific Mauritanian skill set. Yemen is the other major area that deserves attention, especially the area of Hadramaut and specifically the city of Tarim, are very important for Yemeni religious learning. This is Hadramaut is known for its commitment to teaching the Shafi legal school and the Ba Alawi Sufi order. So there is basically a Sufi order that is dominated or composed of people who claim descent from Ali, and they are known as Habib. So someone who comes from this has this Alawite descent is known as Habib, and they have the title of Habib, and they live in this Hadrami region. And beginning in the 15th century, Sufis they established this Sufi order which consisted of descendants of Ali, known as the Ba'alawi order, and they started traveling outside of Hadramaut and expanding their establishing networks of learning and schools outside of Hadramaut, especially along the Indian Ocean. So in places like South Asia, East Africa, Southeast Asia, these are all regions that are tied to Yemen, southern Yemen, through the Indian Ocean trade. And because you have all of these Hadrami, Ba'alawi, Shafi Sufis traveling to all of these places and converting people or spreading knowledge to these places, this is one way that they become famous. This is one way that Hadramaut becomes known as kind of like a famous center of learning. So do they have institutions there? Yeah, they have a institution called the Ribat of Tarim that was established in 1887, and more recently a university called Dar al-Mustafa. And you can just think of many people today who are famous, like, Habib Omar bin Hafid or Habib Ali al-Jifri. Their names, Habib, indicate that they are from this Ba'alawi order, and they have this link to Hadramaut. So, well, if you're talking about studying kind of with very traditional approaches, Mauritania and Yemen are two places in the 20th century that have a strong reputation for offering those kind of opportunities. Okay, so
One question. One question. It's this is outside of the spectrum of Sunnism, but you have the Ibadis in Yemen or in Oman, right next to Yemen, and they were not really ever colonized. So I went there for a bit, but I didn't stay that long. I was wondering, do you have any insight into whether they still have any remnants of their madrasa system, or did they self update to using a more university system, and does the government control it there? Do you have
my
any insight
guess
into
would
that?
be that they have. I don't actually know that much about Ibadism except for just some general remarks. When we talk about Ibadis or Shia, like 12er Shia, one of the things that they will do is, yeah, they will establish universities, but they also start moving towards a generic, non sectarian form of Islamic identity. This is something that you have. Especially, it's very important in Egypt in particular. They have kind of in the 1950s or the 1960s, they established this institution. It's like the Taqrib movement, but basically get all of the Sunni schools to move together, move closer to one another, and to like reduce mutual takfir and to increase cooperation with one another. This is something that you find. Something that you find since the late 19th century, but especially in the 1950s. And my understanding is that just as this is just as this has impacted Sunni Shia relations, this has impacted Ibadi relations. So, if I remember correctly, I've seen like Ibadi scholars study in Al Azhar. Rarely, I've seen them, but this is something where there will be a type of exchange. And I would assume that their own Ibadi doctrines are things which play down past forms of sectarian identity, emphasize the importance of the Quran, emphasize the importance of like ijtihad and absence of taqlid today. That is what I would guess. And they then also that they're going to try and reduce practices. One of the things that you see among the Shia, Twelver, Zaidi, I believe it's true of Ibadi as well. My impression, although I would need to check. I know it's true of Zaidis and Twelvers. I believe it's true of Ibadis, although I need to check. But they will start moving in terms of their practices closer to Sunnism. Like they start moving towards a generic Islamic identity. And you see this in the same way as Christians in the modern period, they start moving away from distinctive Catholic, Orthodox, or Protestant identities, like a generic Christian identity. The same thing with Buddhists. I do think you see this as well when we talk about Muslim groups.
Thank you for that. I appreciate it. And they are definitely, they do de-emphasize sectarianism. That much is for sure.
So,
well, thank you so much. Yeah, I appreciate it. Thank you, Dr. Arya, for this wonderful presentation. And I look forward to the next episode. Thank you very much for presenting. Do you have any final words or anything before we wrap it up?
No, it's just an honor, and I hope that people find this useful. I remember when I was 18, I was very confused. What does it take to be a Muslim scholar? Like, what does it mean when we say that someone is a sheikh and a scholar? And like, what's the difference? Why would someone go to one country as opposed to another country? Why are people talking about going to the desert in Mauritania? Like, well, what's a Dale Bandy? Like, these are questions that I had, but I hope these are things that we will have the opportunity to clarify in the upcoming episodes.
Definitely. I think people would definitely find it useful. Thank you so much, and may Allah accept your efforts. Jazakumullah khairan. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.